Stalactite formations. Now, as these mineral deposits are built up, here it says New Mexico's unfinished symphony. It started 250 million years ago, Carlsbad Caverns. See, scientists said that you build up about 1 inch of this every 2,000 years. So that can account for the hundreds of millions of years that you have a stalactite formation. However, they went down under the Lincoln Memorial built in 1922. They went there in the 1960s and found 50-inch stalactites. That's 50-inch stalactites in about 40 years. And they said 1 inch every 2,000 years? Well, they knew it didn't work there. Right here you see this bat. That's the head of a bat right there. And you can see its wings here. That bat was covered up in flowstone before it had a chance to decay. That happened pretty quick. This is a lead mine over in Australia. They built this mine 55 years before they took this picture. They went down in there. There's a couple of miners standing right here, and up here's a sign. Compare those miners there with the size of the stalactite formations in 55 years. So under the right conditions, they can form a lot in a very short time. Doesn't take millions of years. This right here, that was formed in 100 years from a pipe in a man's backyard. That just a small pipe about this big around that had this water seeping out of it and the minerals and stuff in there that stains your bathtub and stuff. It started building this stuff up, started forming on that. That they're all formed in about 100 years. Now that's a lot of flowstone in 100 years. The Sahara Desert, it's our largest desert. It has a prevailing wind pattern that causes the desert to grow. It's called desertification. They found out at the rate that it's growing, you can account for the whole thing in about 4,000 years. Why did our largest desert start growing about 4,000 years ago? Now we're going to start putting some things together like this. I have a theory about some of this that may help clear some things up. You see, I believe about 6,000 years ago, God created the heaven and the earth. About 4,400 years ago, there was a great flood, and it's awful hard to grow a desert under a flood. Now, that's just my theory about that. But some people say, where do you get that 6,000 years from anyway? Why do you creationists say 6,000 years? Here's a longevity chart. I have a copy of this up on the table if you want to look at it. You can order those, by the way, from Dr. Kent Hovind. Has the address on there. But they have added up all the ages from Adam all the way to Joseph, and then they figured up from there up to the time of Christ, and then up to today. Well, you can account for everybody all the way back to Adam in less than 6,000 years. So that's one of the reasons why we believe it was about 6,000 years, okay? Here's a Jewish calendar. I have a copy of that up here on the table. This is a 97-98 edition. But they don't go by that number because they don't believe Jesus was the Messiah. So they go by this other number, 5,758. Less than 6,000 years. I asked an Orthodox Jew, I said, well, you could be off a couple hundred years, because he said they were doing that from the time of creation. So, well, I don't think so. We got pretty accurate records. But under 6,000 years anyway, so right. Now, this is a porthole from a space capsule. If you could see one of these up close, a friend of mine has one. It looks like it's been sandblasted. You see, as the Earth is going through space, it's running into space dust. Now, the moon is growing around the Earth, but the Earth has an atmosphere, and it has storms, so most of it gets burned off and everything. The moon doesn't have that. A friend of mine, by the way, said, hey, you hear about the new restaurant they opened up on the moon? The food is out of this world, but there's no atmosphere at all. I have to take his word for it. But as the moon is running into all the space dust, see, before it made their first moon landing, they thought, man, there must be miles of space dust up there. Because they said it's been forming about 1 inch every 10,000 years. If you go back 4 billion years, boy, there's got to be miles of space dust. So we were kind of concerned. Here it said, Littleton felt that X-rays and UV light striking exposed moon rocks could, during the age of the moon, be sufficient to form a layer over it several miles deep. And that's not even considering the dust it's running into. That's just from the ultraviolet light. Now, Isaac Asimov, writing in Science Digest in 1959, before he made their first moon landing, he said, I get a picture, therefore, of the first spaceship picking out a nice level place for landing purposes, coming in slowly downward, tail first, and sinking majestically out of sight. See, they were afraid. Here's a children's book from 1959, says when they go to the moon someday, there's just deep gray dust up there on the moon. When they made their first moon landing, they had these long legs on there and put these big pads on there for landing purposes. They were hoping that they wouldn't sink out of sight. A number of years ago, Bob Hope interviewed Neil Armstrong, and he said, Neil, when you made that first moon landing, what was the thing that you feared the most? He says, man, we were afraid. They told us that you guys could sink out of sight and we won't be able to rescue you because there's mild of space dust on that planet, on the moon. So when I made my famous statement, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, Most people had no idea what was going through my mind. He thought it could be it, and he's going to sink out of sight, and he's up there for the rest of his life. For eternity, he thought he was stuck there. So they found out that it said about 1 inch every 10,000 years, but they found out the average depth of the dust on the moon was 6/10 of an inch. Well, that's only about 6,000 years worth of space dust. Well, where's all the dust? Nobody said this, I don't think, but I bet some of them were thinking, some of those evolutionary scientists back then were thinking, I bet those fundamentalists heard about this, and they went up there with the big vacuum cleaner. They're trying to make us look bad, get rid of all the dust. Here's a human population chart. Now, this chart is using a growth rate that is about 25% below our growth rate today to factor in for wars and famines and disease and things. You can go from 6 billion people today back to 8 people in less than 4,000 years at that growth rate. Now, this is a public school science textbook. They used a common growth rate, did not factor us in for wars and famines and things. They still could only go back to 7,000 BC, and then they straight line for 2 million years. Well, what do you expect them to do? I mean, you got to count for that millions of years. There's no growth rate for some reason for 2 million years, and all of a sudden it just took off for some reason. We're not sure. Not sure why. See, they know that if you go at a common growth rate, way below the common growth rate, if you do that for 2 or 3 million years, when they say how long man's been here, you would have about 150,000 people per square inch on planet Earth. That would be more people than there are atoms in the universe. Where's all the people? I mean, I think that would be pretty crowded if you had 150,000 per square inch. That'd be pretty difficult. A friend of mine said in the city limits of Jacksonville, Florida, inside the city limits, now they're a little bit different situation. They extended the city limits to include the whole county, but even that though, they said they have about 25 billion square feet inside the city limits of Jacksonville, Florida. I looked up an encyclopedia and I figured it out. Use a calculator, and he was right. A little over 25 billion square feet. There are only 6 billion people in the world. You know, if you cleared out the buildings and stood everybody upright and gave them 4 square feet of space, you could put everybody in the whole world inside the city limits of Jacksonville, Florida, and have space left over. What they're trying to tell us is too crowded. Well, in some places, maybe. Folks, if it's crowded where you are, just move, okay? There's lots of room out there if we just get people to spread out a little bit. I know some places they're too crowded right there, so just get to move out a little bit. Then we'll have the government quit paying people not to grow crops, and we'll have enough food for everybody, and we'll be fine. See, they say it's too crowded, and that justifies killing some babies and some old folks and some infirmed and things like this. We don't have to kill anybody. Just take them, spread out a little bit, and to give them some more food, and we'll be okay. Now, up to this point, we have just been gathering information. From our information we've gathered, what kind of a hypothesis would you come up with to answer your question? What kind of an answer? How old is the Earth? I mean, would you say that, oh, it's probably billions of years old, just from looking at the world around us? No, probably, but the kids in the public schools, they're not allowed to see most of this stuff. I know I tried to show it here a couple months back in one of the larger high schools in the Flint area. The principal shut me down halfway through my presentation and said, well, if we showed these kids this stuff that you want to show them, and I'm just showing the scientific evidence. So what those kids then, they think, well, if this is true, then evolution can't be true, and they just might believe what you're teaching automatically. Well, what's the problem? We're just letting them see scientific evidence. But they don't want stuff like this. See, if it's scientific evidence and it points to a young Earth and a great flood, well, that's religious in nature. We need to keep that evidence out of the textbook. So all we have left is some evidence that they think they can interpret it as being old. See, that's not honest science. That's not fair.